Welcome to everybody. My name is Nishan Bolton, the Executive Director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. Today we celebrate the life and legacy of Ahmed Kathrada on the occasion of his 5th death anniversary. We are gathered here to pay tribute to Kathy, who died on the 28th of March 2017 after almost 75 years of activism. Kathy believed dearly in the ideal of a world that was inclusive, equal, and free in all its dimensions. In honor of his legacy, this foundation continues a path of non-racialism and works towards advancing democracy in South Africa. We remain visible, vocal, and relevant to the issues which he would have been concerned about today, which today had he been alive, he would have joined us in the march in Johannesburg against xenophobia, and would also have had very strong views on global issues, which perhaps would have been different from many in this country today. As Kathy reminded us continuously, freedom did not fall from the sky, but it came at a huge cost and sacrifice. We owe it to him to continue championing the fight for freedom and democracy in South Africa. So today's event is part of a series of conversations. Tomorrow, many will gather at Constitutional Hill in the afternoon for a physical event of tribute and remembrance. But I'm now going to hand over to one of our special guests who attended Kathy's 80th birthday in Lenasia, who more than speaking also sang there. And I really wish that we could have played some of that recording here. But it's a huge honor to introduce Alfre Woodard, who is a deeply respected, award-winning actor, producer, and political activist, a longtime friend of Kathy. She was the founder of Artists for a New South Africa and received the Order of the Companions of Oliver Tambo in silver in recognition of her efforts. So it's over to Alfre, but before that, thanks to everybody and particularly the US friends who have worked tirelessly over the last few months to pull off today's event. Thanks, Palesa, and greetings to everybody.
I have to say, you make me smile when you talk about that 80th birthday, because I thought, you know, I'd landed and I hadn't had any sleep coming from California. And I thought, oh, I'll go. It's an 80th birthday party. It'll take a couple of hours. Well, at 3 in the morning, there was just dessert coming and everybody was still dancing. And I always think of Kathy as being in constant celebration, and that's how we move forward in the struggle, is with joy. I have to tell you, it is an honor to be here today in such an esteemed gathering of speakers and guests. Some of us were Kathy's dear friends and comrades, some close colleagues, but I am also very glad to be joined by people he never met, but surely would have been delighted to know. Anytime any of us in any nation stands up for justice and democracy against the forces of bigotry, hatred, and fascism, we are carrying on Ahmed Kathrada's vital legacy, adding our voices to his unwavering commitment to equality, to inclusion, and to truth. Let me quote Kathy so we can be lifted up by his words. Here he's speaking about his 26-year experience in prison. On the one hand, we had to learn tolerance, patience, adjustment, courage, resistance. We had to adjust to the practices, the idiosyncrasies of fellow prisoners who came from various backgrounds, religious and cultural. On the other hand, we had to resist the efforts to humiliate us, to deprive us of our humanity. We succeeded in all of this. He went on to write, "We will not forget the brutality of apartheid. We will not want Robben Island to be a monument of our hardship, though, and suffering. We would want it to be a triumph of the human spirit against the forces of evil, a triumph of wisdom and largeness of spirit against small minds and pettiness, a triumph of courage and determination over human frailty and weaknesses, the triumph of the new South Africa over the old. The first day I ever spent with my hero, Ahmed Kathrada, who then became my dear friend, Kathy, was also my first trip to the island, to Robben Island. And I wrote this on that transformative day in 1995. On a tour to Robben Island, Ahmed Kathrada, ex-political prisoner number 468/64, took me by the hand and led me into a place so small, I couldn't imagine how it could have held dreams so immense. I crossed not into his prison cell block, but into a sanctuary, a place made sacred by the power of ideas shared and the integrity of the lives lived there. After his release, we all know Kathy worked diligently to build his nation's new democracy. He also spoke out about the threats to that democracy. In 2012, he said, South Africa's liberation struggle, which culminated in the unbanning of the African National Congress, the release of political prisoners and a free election in 1994, signifies in the process and institutions of democracy to millions inside and outside the country. Yet there are developments that can constitute threats to our democracy. It is disturbing that after 18 years into our democracy, elements in the ruling party regard opposition parties as enemies and not as rivals. Opposition parties have been and still are the established ingredient of all democracies. They exist under the protection of the Constitution and should be dealt with accordingly. Utterances by senior leaders regarding the judiciary and their calls for a review of the Constitution are also matters of grave concern. If allowed to go unchecked, they will undermine the independence of these vital pillars of our young democracy. Another growing threat is the ignorance of young people about the history of our struggle. They need to know that with freedom comes responsibility. Freedom did not fall from heaven. It was fought for at great cost and sacrifice. And unless young people know how freedom came, they cannot be held responsible for actions and utterances that are inconsistent with the history of the freedom struggle. It must be a critical understanding of history that corrects distorted versions of liberation in which only certain groupings are seen to have fought for freedom. While democracy has given people the right to vote, the vast majority of people remain stricken by poverty. Protests over slow service delivery have not been met with the seriousness and urgency they deserve. They are the convergence of a set of grievances cutting across urban, renewal, middle, and working classes. It is a threat because growing inequality results in a loss of faith in the institutions of democracy. The preservation of democracy in our country, as elsewhere in the world, is not guaranteed, nor should it be. It is yet to be fought for with integrity and selflessness. I think both of our nations would do well to heed Kathy's warnings, and I'm so glad to be a part of this effort to call attention to the threats our democracies face today. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce another one of my heroes I am privileged to have as a friend. Barbara Hogan is the only white woman ever convicted of treason by the apartheid government, for which she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. She was finally released the same week as Madiba. She went on to be elected to Parliament, where she was an outspoken proponent for human rights, HIV/AIDS, and fiscal accountability. Barbara helped draft the financial clauses of the country's new constitution. And when Kgalema Motlanthe, oh God, I got Kgalema's name out, took office as the interim president, he appointed Hogan as the Minister of Health, ending the tragic years of governmental AIDS denialism. Barbara was later appointed Minister of Public Enterprises. Barbara was also Kathy's longtime partner. Named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world, Barbara Hogan is a human rights activist and political leader known for her integrity, her intelligence, and for fearlessly speaking truth to power. Barbara.
You know, when I was preparing for this particular event, I was so aware of just the warmth with which Cassie was embraced by many of the US friends who are present here, but others who we're all aware of in the broader community abroad. And it was lovely to see. Cassie absolutely loved the warmth and the love and admiration, everything that everybody showered rightfully on him. And it made me think of Cassie's international trips. Remember, this was a young man who at the age of 34 went to prison and came out when he was 60. So much of his life taken from him. And I'm very grateful that in the year 1951, he traveled abroad and was assigned to work for the World Federation of Democratic Youth in Hungary, in Budapest. That was just several years after that horrific World War II. And Cassie must have been a witness to the devastation that that war had wrought on the peoples of Europe and beyond, and Eurasia and everywhere else. In that period alone, 30 million people were displaced and dispersed from in that period alone. Railway lines, communications, homes, cities were devastated. And Cassie arrived in Budapest shortly after the cessation of that war. In 1945, children in Budapest were living on 556 calories a day when you were supposed to be getting between 1,400 and more. So Cassie had ample time to be a witness to the effects of fascism, and most importantly, a witness to war. And it is very interesting in his book, in his memoirs, and he often spoke to me about this, is there were two things that, besides just being a witness to this devastation, there were two things that affected him very deeply. One was he went on a trip to Auschwitz, and at Auschwitz, it had still not been properly cleared up. There were still bones on the ground. And Cassie talks about just how devastating it was to see what had happened there. And in his very humane way, he collected a few small bones, which he took home with him, put it in a glass bottle on his mantelpiece to remind himself and everyone of the consequences of fascism, of racism, of bigotry, of ethnic cleansing. The second thing that really made a huge impression, remember Hungary at that time was now incorporated within the USSR. And he says one night they were out, and coming back, he saw people, men just wearing shirts in the bitter cold, working as laborers. And he asked his hosts and said, "Why is this happening?" And they said, no, they're just political prisoners. Cassie had been a member of the South African Communist Party, had been a very active member of the youth league of the Communist Party. But he was never a person who believed in dogma. And above all, he was a humanist. And these things, as deep a humanist as he was, affected him very deeply and made him think through the consequences of Stalinism, the consequences of fascism, of what genocide really can be and how awful a war can be. And he says when he was looking at Dresden and Berlin, he, in later years, was reminded of District 6, of just people's areas of where they live just being razed to the ground. And for me, I have always been so terribly intrigued and proud of Kathy for his ability to be strategically smart, to have a political nous, to understand ideology but never be bound and blinded by it, and the depths of his human response to suffering and inequality. And that guided his politics all the way through, from that moment onwards, so from early on and all the way through his life until the day he died. Remember, when they wanted to operate him on March the 21st, Human Rights Day, in prison, he fought them off and said to them, I know my rights. Up till a couple of days before he died, he was demanding his rights in hospital. And that is why now, I know the other speakers will be talking about South Africa. But I do think in the context of the invasion of Ukraine, that I do need to say, and I'm sure Kathy would have a sympathy, I'm not projecting onto him, but I'm sure with his depths as an historian and a humanist, he would have an understanding of the dynamics there. And with me, would share a bafflement at the way our own government is responding. Not for me to understand the intricacies of international diplomacy, not for me to stand and shout, but to me, it has just been bewildering. In the lack of a better response, of a more comprehensive response from government, it almost seems that it's a reflex of a Cold War that has disappeared a long time ago, of Cold War politics, and we're now in a different generation completely. A misunderstanding of what exactly is happening in Ukraine, and it just comes across heartless in many ways. And it breaks my heart. And I think in many ways, Kathy's heart was also broken when we took similar stances on Zimbabwe, at the time when Zimbabwe was in its moments of need, because we had so much moral heft as coming through apartheid, through negotiated settlement. We had so much moral gravitas, and we seemed to be sacrificing it. We could really be a force. And so those are the words that I would like to say today about Catherine, what I've been thinking about him. In this time, 5 years hence, he would have been very, as he read every newspaper, listened to every news broadcast, he would have been very much on top of these issues, and having lived so close as a youngster to those areas, he would have been very, very distressed about all of this. And the world itself is in a terrible, has got terrible extremities beginning to besiege it. And never as before, then since I would imagine the Second World War, is democracy in such jeopardy. And that is why I'm very grateful to hear what other people are going to say today about the USA, South Africa, democracy in general. Where are we, and the extremities that are percolating up. So thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Thank you so much. We will now show that funny face that you wanted us to see, and also hear the voice that we have missed over the last few years as well. This is a very short video clip done on the occasion of Kathy's 80th birthday. Artists for a New South Africa, instrumental in getting this done, and the wonderful voice of Morgan Freeman as a narrator is what you will hear. So Irfan, can we get over to the documentary, please?
In 1929, Ahmed Kathrada was born to an Indian family in South Africa when racial discrimination was the law of the land. At a young age, Kathy joined the struggle for liberation. Risking his freedom for the rights of all South Africans, he ultimately faced the death penalty alongside Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu. They were given life at hard labor and sent to Robben Island. People the world over called for their release.
Robben Island was a microcosm of how apartheid applied in South Africa. I stayed in the cell for 17 and a half years. If you stood here and looked out, not only can you see Cape Town, which is quite a distance, but the warders going to the harbor with their kids. That was the advantage of the cell. The main deprivation was children. You miss children. Mr. Mandela saw his two little girls when they were 2 and 3. Right. The next time he saw them was when they were over 16. A prisoner never loses hope. Never, ever. Although we were sentenced to life imprisonment, and for political prisoners, life meant life.
After 26 years, Kathy and his comrades walked free, infusing the struggle with new hope.
He got released and he arrived in Johannesburg. I was very good. It was a moving experience.
6 months later, Nelson Mandela was also a free man. They negotiated an end to apartheid and set to work building a new nation. Prisoner Mandela became President Mandela with Kathrada as his advisor. They chose the path of truth and reconciliation over revenge.
I have been with Kathy since the late 40s. I believe in surrounding myself with strong characters who will tell me when I'm wrong, and he is that character.
Old comrades worked with young leaders to make their highest ideals the law of the land.
There are many aspects of his life. His courage, his foresight, his thoroughness, one would like to emulate that.
Kathy teaches people in South Africa and around the world about the history, triumphs, and lessons of the journey to freedom. He is a vigilant champion of ethical standards and of racial equality.
We want Robben Island to be a monument. One wants to perpetuate the positive aspects, and that is a place of triumph. Because Robben Island played a very important role in the struggle, although we were in prison. And the struggle to crush apartheid was in some ways less difficult than the struggle we are facing now. It's always easier to crush something than to build.
He has been a great instrument of the movement. That is what he has brought. Confidence in the future.
Ahmed Kathrada is a principled, modest, and gentle man. He lives by his belief that truth and justice will always triumph. His life is an ongoing example of the unbeatable power of love.
Barbara, if we'll just ask you to just introduce Palesa, please, before Palesa comes in. Thank you.
Palesa Morudu, I met many years ago with Kathy when she was appointed as the head of marketing and communications on Robben Island. And she was a breath of fresh air. Young, feisty, smart, clever, and Kathy absolutely enjoyed her kind of energy. And those were difficult times. I mean, Palesa would know, you know, the state, the capture of state-run enterprises was already starting in those days for certain individuals. But it's always been a matter of great interest to watch Palesa in the roles that she's assumed later on in life. Of course, she is a director and a writer for the charity Global Strategic Communications, quite frankly, one of the famous editing companies in South Africa that is also based in Washington. She has an honors degree in international relations from Rhodes University, but she is one of my favorite commentators. Palesa, there are some people that you know what they're going to say, and you know that you watch for what some people are going to say because it is considered, it's incisive, and it is not there to just shout and scream and make a noise. So, Sean, it was great pleasure that I introduced Palesa to us here. I'm sure she's going to post it with her visual acuity, her incredible political understanding of our times. And so welcome, Palesa. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And it's really, really good to see you. And once again, welcome everyone to this webinar. We have come together to celebrate the life of a South African icon, a fighter for freedom, and a strong believer in the global project for democracy and human rights. Kathy, as we all knew him, would be thrilled that we gathered to talk about an ideal and a project that he dedicated all of his adult life, including spending many years in jail for it. But to help us reflect on Kathy's life and the challenges of facing democracy today, we have invited Ambassador Patrick Gaspard and Minister Pravin Gordhan. The two gentlemen don't need much introduction, really. They are very familiar to many of you attending this webinar today. Mr. Gaspard is former ambassador to South Africa. Among his many achievements as ambassador was to redesign US government policy and program on HIV and AIDS in South Africa. He also successfully renegotiated the renewal of Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. But most notable for me is that by the time Mr. Gaspard left South Africa, he was really regarded as the adopted son of South Africa. And as far as I'm concerned, he can come in and go into the country as he wishes. Today, Ambassador Gaspard is CEO and President at the Center for American Progress. Thank you, Ambassador, and it's a great pleasure to have you with us this morning or this afternoon in South Africa. The other guest that
the honor is mine.
Great. And the other guest that we have is Minister Pravin Gordhan. Minister Gordhan has a very long CV. He was a leading anti-apartheid activist for many years, was part of the ANC leadership to negotiate with the apartheid government from 1990 to 1994. After 1994 breakthrough, Minister Gordhan served as a member of parliament in South Africa. He was also appointed the Commissioner of the South Africa Revenue Services. He was also appointed and also removed as the Minister of Finance to much national unhappiness. He now has what I think is the most difficult jobs to have in South Africa as Minister of Public Enterprises. But I promise you, PG, that I won't be asking you anything about ESCOM of the South African Airways. So welcome to both of you. So
thank you very much.
Okay, so when we conceptualized this webinar a few months ago, our idea was to really focus on challenges of democracy in South Africa and the United States. But sadly, as Barbara said, we have to start in Europe with the war on Ukraine. The frightening developments in that part of the world, towns and cities are being bombed and reduced to rubble. millions of refugees across that country going into many parts of Europe, death and destruction emanating from the war on Ukraine. So Ambassador Gaspard, I'm going to start with you. This conflict has been described by many in Europe and in North America as a clash between autocracy and democracy. I'm wondering if you could take a few minutes in your opening remarks to reflect on what this means for the project of democracy around the world.
Thank you so much.
Gaspard.
Thank you so much, Palesa. And it's fantastic to be joined in conversation with Minister Gordhan. And thank you to Barbara Hogan for her leadership and her warmth today, and Alfre Woodard for all that she's done for the bilateral relationship between Americans and South Africans. It's terribly important that we do begin with the Ukraine as we try to really bring into sharp relief this question of the ascension of liberalism, autocracy, and the challenges of democracy. We should be clear that irrespective of the rhetoric from Vladimir Putin, his incursion into the Ukraine does not result from failed negotiations around NATO and that consideration. It's been obvious for some time that this ambition existed for Vladimir Putin and his circle of oligarchs, and it arises mostly from a desire to restore Russia's imperium borders, and because of the threat of having a satellite, a neighbor in your orbit with freedoms that were not available within your own sovereign borders. That presented a near and present danger and threat that I think the Russian leadership believed to be insidious. The resulting violation of the people of Ukraine is barbaric, and all of us, all nations, should be able to say clearly that war is wrong, the killing of civilians is wrong. Palesa, you know that when I was privileged to serve in South Africa, I didn't hesitate to call out the historic errors that I believe my nation, the United States, had made when it came to attacks in other countries, the engagement with civilians. And just as I called out my own nation then, it's right that I would call out Russia today. But I want to go a little further here and note, because it's difficult not to note, the disparity in the treatment of Ukrainian refugees versus what we saw with Syrian, Afghani, Sudanese refugees in the last few years in places like Poland, where they were all otherized, treated like criminals, not granted amnesty status whatsoever. And it stands in stark contrast to what we're seeing today. It is right and correct that the entire world should embrace Ukrainian refugees, but that does call into question the disparity that we are experiencing in this moment, particularly as we see students from South Asia, from Sub-Saharan Africa who are in Ukraine, who are being treated quite differently at those borders. Important conversations to have.
Thank you so much for that, Ambassador Gaspard. I'm going to move to Minister Gordhan. South Africa has adopted what might be considered a minority position on Russia's war on Ukraine, certainly seen through the lens of the vote at the United Nations General Assembly. I'll be keen to hear your views on that, and also your view on whether this war actually impacts on democracy and the rights of nations to self-determination.
Like Patrick, let me thank the Kathrada Foundation and yourself for asking me to participate on this very important occasion. 5 years ago, you pointed out in your opening remarks that some interesting things happened, like people getting fired and so on. So it's an interesting part of our history. And of course, it's a very important occasion to constantly recall Ahmed Kathrada and his generation, because they must continue to act as our role models. They must continue to act as our conscience. They must continue to act as guiders of newer generations of South Africans, and indeed young people throughout the world, who seem to be more orientated towards consumerism, a limited understanding of the kind of history that we come from, and the kind of sacrifices that this generation, and of course many others, have made over a period of time. So thank you very much for that privilege, and it's nice to also see my sister, colleague, and comrade Barbara on the other side of this video. On the Ukraine-Russia question, I think we share, and I certainly share Patrick's view and the view of many, that in any situation where you have ordinary civilians who have played no role in inspiring war or conflict, suffering as they are suffering in the Ukraine situation, we must actually ask for this war to, or whatever you want to call it, to end sooner rather than later. The kind of balancing act that we see from certain countries which supply weaponry but don't want to get involved in the war is also fascinating to watch at this particular point in time. And I know that President Ramaphosa has been talking to all the role players in this conflict, including the president of Ukraine, I think, more recently, to promote the idea that there need to be talks, there need to be mediation, there needs to be a ceasefire, because wars generally end in talks. They will never resolve any situation in themselves. But on the more general question, Palesa, I think that perhaps the question, democracy versus autocracy, given the last decade or so of experience around the world, is not quite the right question, because democracy itself has been weakened around the world. Democracy in countries that have proclaimed themselves to be prototypes or epitomes of democracy have themselves given rise to right-wing movements, given rise to very negative populism, have infected, if you like, the political climate, both in those respective countries, but elsewhere in the world as well. And in South Africa, we've been an interesting but prime example of what it means to have a small group of people capture the institutions of the state over the last 8 to 10 years and destroy institutions that were hard fought for and won and created over a period of time to serve the people of South Africa. We are now in the process of rebuilding. So I think the question we need to ask is, how do we actually deepen democracy? Because democracy is supposed to be, as Abraham Lincoln said, for the people, by the people, of the people. But the people generally around the world, and in many of these countries, have very little influence today. It's the elites. Some will call them oligarchs in some countries, call them whatever you will. But it's the elites who dictate the politics of a country. It's the pandemic has taught us that inequality now appears both in developed and in developed countries. There's an increasing reflection, which I'm sure Patrick's new role might be engaged with as well, which is, what kind of capitalism do we have? And does it need to be repurposed and founded on a different set of principles? And I'm sure we'll discuss more of that as we go on. Thank you.
Okay. No, thank you. I mean, I think that's quite interesting what you're saying, Minister Gordhan, because it, it's a segue into the next question to Ambassador Gaspard. I mean, if we look at what happened 30 years ago with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the West literally declaring victory in the Cold War, that was accompanied by a sense of triumphalism, really. But the lived experience of the past 30 years, we've seen escalation of wars. We've seen, we've experienced persistent deep and deepening inequality around the world. We've seen threats to the and the return of this strongman politics. And my question to you is, what do you think went wrong with the project of liberal democracy over the past 30 years? And I think Minister Gordhan alluded to some of that, but I'd like to get your sense about what do you think went wrong?
What a powerfully provocative question. And as always, Minister Gordhan is to respond to a question in the most comprehensive fashion that brings in our culture and history. You know, I think that it's wrong, Palesa, to begin as your line of demarcation the end of the Cold War. Let's be like really candid and really thorough in examining the history and appreciate that democracy has not actually been the natural order in the state of humanity, the state of the world, if we look throughout the long course of recorded history. Democracy has actually existed in most of our nations a relatively short amount of time, as opposed to imperial rule, autocracies, dictatorships, or as Minister Gordhan made clear, rule of elite. To take the country that I sit in as an example, the United States, it is clear to anyone who examines the history that Minister Gordhan just lifted up Abraham Lincoln's creed of by and for the people. Democracy did not have that paradigm as its defining feature in America until after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1864. So for the vast majority of American history, you had rule by elites, for elites that benefited greatly elites. There was misogyny involved, racism involved in rule in America, classism involved throughout the entirety of the history. And it took a civil war where hundreds of thousands of lives were lost in the country before there was an orientation towards inclusive, participatory democracy. And then another 100 years beyond that civil war to codify into law the instincts of the founders. So I want to be clear that across the board, when you ask why the project of liberal democracy has failed for the last 3 decades, or has moved in a precipitous decline in the last several decades, we should be clear that that has not been the natural order of things. It has not been the predetermined destination of most of our nations. Instead, there's been an instinct that many of us, most of humanity, carry towards freedom, and then a tremendous amount of work that's had to occur by people like Ahmed Kathrada to impose their will on the arc of history to make sure that it bends towards righteousness, because that has not been the natural path. So I want to say that at first. And then, I think Minister Gordhan said something else that was really critical, and he suggested that in my new role as president of the Center for American Progress, perhaps I'm taking up the overwhelming question of the future and future direction of the concentration of capital. We know that both in South Africa and in the United States, we have a very small percentage of the population controlling vast amounts of wealth. I think in South Africa, you have 10% of your population controlling 70% of all household wealth. In the United States, we have 10% that control about 80% of household wealth and GDP outputs as well. And if we look at the crisis in affordability that we have in the basic provision of goods and services, from healthcare to education, it's clear that liberal elites, progressive elites, the left, even when they manage to accrue power, are not able to marshal the political will to alter the direction of the downward pressure in capitalism to enough of an extent to create a more broadly shared prosperity. It is impossible. If you look at the trends, if you look at Freedom House reports on the trends that we have seen in democratic decline, if you look at a report that my institution produced in 2015 that looked at 20 leading developed nations over the course of 140 years of history, and showed without any doubt whatsoever that every single time you had a period of economic decline, in the elections that occurred in the short window thereafter the decline, you'd see a significant uptick in right-wing populism made manifest in the election outcome. It's impossible for me to unpack the decline of democracy from the decline in wages, the decline in, I'm originally a union organizer, the decline in union density that we have in both of our countries, and the ability of populists to exploit cultural differences that exist between people. We saw that in the July disturbances that you had in South Africa, and certainly in the January 6th insurrection in the United States as well.
Yeah, I mean, that it's a segue into the next question to Minister Gordhan, because it really is around the theme of the strong man, the politics of the strong man in South Africa, in the person of Jacob Zuma, who claimed to represent the poor, but in fact became the face of what is termed in South Africa state capture. And I want to ask Minister Gordhan, what is it in our system of democracy that made it possible for a figure like him, and there are many figures like him, you know, percolating in the political space in South Africa, that a person like it to emerge, and what made it possible for us to be able to remove him? I'd like you to maybe reflect on that. What is it in the system that makes it possible for figures like that to emerge?
Well, that's the other lesson of the last possibly 2 decades or so, that having a good democratic constitution based on the best experiences of humanity around the world, which is what the South African Constitution tried to reflect, including our own idiosyncratic challenges as well, in itself is not a guarantee that you shall have a perpetuation of democracy. Because what we've learned is that institutions can in fact be, inverted commas, captured. Institutions can be repurposed. Institutions ultimately have human beings. And most of them find their way into those institutions through political processes. And those political processes can in fact be manipulated in one way or another. And South Africa, during that period, reflected that perfectly. So the question that arises is, what then is going to give us a new set of guarantees, if you like, that the fundamental principles of democracy, which is one where a political system enhances a particular country's historical trajectory, but in the main benefits all of its population, so that they lead a better, more dignified and more decent life than they've led before. And perhaps the question, I mean, the answer there lies in what many are now propagating, which is that the old social contract, whether it's globally or in specific countries, has broken down. That what was created around the Second World War or subsequently after 1989 no longer persists as a valid foundation for the kind of challenges that humanity faces, whether it's climate change, whether it's the economic inequality, the uneven development that we have around the world, the dominance of financial systems as you see it now, as well, in the control of the financial system, which lies in the hands of a few people, even globally. We've learned through the pandemic that self-interest comes before anything else. When the distribution of vaccines came into question. And even today, the poorest countries in the world are, inverted commas, waiting for vaccines, both on the African continent and elsewhere as well, for a pandemic that is still pretty much with us at this point in time. So perhaps the question, Palesa, needs to be, what is this new social contract? How can we ensure that the general population is not fed with fake news, but real news, and a real understanding of both the politics and economics of a particular society and the globe, and that which progressives dream about and have been motivated by over the years, which is where a population is able to act in its own interest, is able to let that influence the way in which decisions are actually made. And in that instance, I think that the democratic system doesn't serve what we would call the masses. And the masses are unable to actually influence decisions made in a democratic system as well. So are new institutions required? What does the meaning of inclusivity mean at this point in time, both in growth terms, but more importantly, in what we in South Africa would call the massification of benefits? So whether it's Patrick's country, where if one had to have a universal health care system that looks after everybody in that country, or other countries in the world as well, including our own, how do we make that possible? Reference was made earlier on to basic service delivery, water. You said you won't ask me about Eskom, thank you. But electricity and just a decent living environment in which children can grow up in a healthy way and be assured of a proper future for themselves and for their own development as well. So that, in as much as Kathy was motivated by the various elements that Barbara mentioned earlier on, we require new Kathys to now emerge amongst the younger generation, who will be still motivated by the necessity for humanity to progress to the next level, to ensure that all 7 billion people on Earth lead a very different life from the one that they've led over the last 2 decades or so, and that ideal must motivate them to become activists, as many of the people on this webinar are, and play their respective roles in that particular regard as well. Because without democratic activists, there's no democracy.
Palesa, is it okay if
Yes, okay. Please, of course.
I want to I want to let my hair down in this conversation, or at least my remaining hair down. There's so much so much that you just said there that I think we need to unpack further, beginning with your description of the accommodations that originate from the extraordinary constitution that South Africa has. I was once at a dinner with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg of the Supreme Court, and I knew that she had glowing things to say about South Africa. I asked her what her experience had been in engaging with South African jurists, and she said, first of all, just understand that if I were going to create a nation overnight and have to recreate a constitution, South Africa's constitution is the one that would be the ideal for me. And I pressed her and I said, I know you've said this before, but why is that the case? She said, because South Africa enshrines the notion of access, like true access to the economic ladder as a basic inalienable right in its constitution, and then has a series of amendments to concretize that. And beginning there as a right, she said, is a profound inspiration. So as I thought about that conversation with the Justice Minister, it reminded me of another experience that I had in South Africa, though, which was with a former anti-apartheid stalwart who had become one of the first ministers in the initial Mandela cabinet. And he told me about an epiphany that he had after he had served for a number of years. He saw a map of housing in South Africa that had been created post-apartheid. And he said that the shocking realization that he had is that as he looked at the map, he saw that Black South Africans had actually been moved further away from the centers of economic commerce and traffic than they had been even during the apartheid period. So he said, here was a chance. We had just come into government. We had the right instinct as it related to providing housing for those who who didn't have this provision in the past, quality housing, but we weren't strategic enough to think about the economic dislocations that we're creating in the kind of architecture that we doubled down on post apartheid. So it was an interesting thing to hear from someone who obviously entered into government with liberal instincts and saw that the lack of a coherent strategy that tied together all of the deployment of these provisions with the intended democratic outcome led to a stifling of Black economic growth. So I'd love to hear how you think about this in the new role that you have now, and as you think about the future of intentional progressive leadership in South Africa. And the other thing that the minister touched on, Palesa, that I think is really important that I neglected to mention as I talked about the decline of democratic practice in the world. Minister Gordhan mentioned disinformation. I think that we cannot overstate the important role that the social media platforms are playing in our politics of the moment. And the role that they're playing is a balkanizing role as each and every one of us go into our own house of mirrors and views that 20 years ago, 25 years ago may have been considered to be on the periphery. You enter into these virtual rooms where you have affirmation, where you have amplification, and it gives one the impression that your extreme views are now mainstreamed. And you exercise them in a fashion that we saw in the U.S. in Charlottesville, where we had white men parading in without mask on, chanting that the Jews will not replace us, and attacking peaceful citizens who didn't look like them in Charlottesville, Virginia, and all of that being endorsed by a president who also understood that a lot of his power accrued from the kinds of conversations that were happening in conspiratorial spaces in Facebook. And of course, we saw that culminate in the big lie in about the 2020 elections. So I just thought the minister really touched on a number of things that I wanted to put a pin in.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of questions coming on the chat, and I'm going to take a few of those. And one of them is really about what you just touched on, Ambassador Gaspard, is what was common between Trump and Zuma in their approaches to democracy. And I'm going to pose that question to both of you. Minister Gordhan, you can talk about Trump, and then Ambassador Gaspard can talk about Jacob Zuma. You go for it.
Yeah, I won't mention names, but you can draw your own conclusions. But I think there's a lot of commonness. One is in the narratives that were created at the time. Secondly, in terms of repurposing of institutions. Thirdly, in terms of the concentration of power and the way in which power was actually exercised. Fourth, in terms of the neglect of the majority, and they became dispensable, so to speak, although the kind of populist language often made reference to the fact that one was acting for their benefit, whilst in fact privately accumulating all sorts of things, including power and wealth for one's own purposes. And a factor that I think the ambassador has mentioned as well is the role of the media. Yeah. Because part of the challenge that we have is, on the one hand, sometimes the echo chamber in which the media speaks, often just reinforcing itself in a particular narrative, and we see a lot of that in South Africa at the moment. Secondly, in terms of the way in which media is, inverted commas, bought off, or has a particular dominant, let's call it ideology for now, in the way, or the paradigm within which the situation around one is actually analyzed and so on.
Yes.
So, I mean, in reference to the earlier point that was made I think spatial planning and replanning is still one of the big challenges that we have in South Africa. If you take the issue of housing opportunity, and in particular, economic opportunities. The second is what the development economists would call path dependency. Elements of apartheid continue. They don't just get erased as one would erase a pencil mark on a page with a rubber. They remain with you unless you can consciously refashion them. And in refashioning them, you would actually act against vested interests as well. And how one overcomes those vested interests is pretty much a challenge. So in South Africa, wealth, as you pointed out, is still pretty much concentrated. And some are reintroducing a language that was last used maybe 12, 14 years ago, which is, are we back to two nations again?
Yeah.
One pretty privileged, and maybe there's an element of the other that has crept into the one, and the other pretty much marginalized at the end of the day. And that's where the concept of a social contract or a social compact comes into being. But that requires inspirational leadership in each sector of society to buy into that particular project as well.
Ambassador, please go ahead.
I was going to say, Palesa, that I'm so happy that I no longer, I'm not currently in government. So for me, this is a diplomacy-free zone. And unlike the minister, I can actually name names. So I'll say this.
Okay, so I think the question really is, what made Trump possible in the United States? I mean, that is the real question that many people grapple with around the world.
Trump is always possible in the United States. Donald Trump is not an outlier at all in America. He just happened to be a gifted savant in communications who understood the performative aspect of politics and knew because of his proximity to certain communities, he understood that he could actually mobilize a base of support for himself within the Republican Party based on issues of race and by lifting up a kind of grievance politic for a constituency that had already expressed those kinds of instincts in the years before Donald Trump became a figure in our politics. But I want to, if I can, I want to kind of widen. I'll say more about Trump, and I'll say a thing or two about President Zuma as well, because now I can. But I think I want to widen the aperture a bit. This is about more than Trump, more than Zuma. You could look at Viktor Orban in Hungary, look at Bolsonaro in Brazil, look at Duterte in the Philippines, look at the trends with Erdogan in Turkey. I could go on and on and on. There are a set of actors around the world who, like Trump and like Jacob Zuma, have all been underestimated in the first instance in their politics. That's a vital thing to understand, both about Donald Trump and about Jacob Zuma. They, like the other leaders that I just named, had a kind of organic proximity to where the grassroots were, to where culture is, and they all understand that culture trumps politics all the time. And if you lead with culture, negatively or positively, you have an ability to mobilize and animate a kind of vote and constituency and electorate that's not available to you if you're just having a strict policy discussion. One of the things that I found really interesting, if you want to understand how Donald Trump is possible and where he comes from, I would go back to the 2008 election in the United States. John McCain is running against Senator Barack Obama. John McCain selects Sarah Palin as his vice presidential candidate. If you're in US politics, you understand that he selects Palin because John McCain is not perceived to be conservative enough for the extreme right wing in the United States. Sarah Palin had said and done a number of things in Alaska that gave the right wing the impression that she was their person. So he selects Sarah Palin. They perform really horribly in debates and in the campaign. Barack Obama and Joe Biden win fairly easily. But an interesting thing happens in 2008 that tells Donald Trump a particular story. If you look at the performance of John McCain across the country, he underperformed against George W. Bush everywhere. George W. Bush had the record for the most votes ever for a Republican. Everywhere in the country, McCain comes in far behind what Bush's mark was, except for a cluster of states in the deep South, the Mississippis of this world, the Tennessees of this world, overperforms George Bush in precincts in those states. Why is that? Barack Obama at that point hadn't been president. These people are not reacting against a record of a president, and they're coming out in greater numbers than they came out to support George Bush in his election or in his re-election. Points to only one thing about Barack Obama that was different than any other candidate that preceded him, that somehow inspired and motivated a new group of voters that hadn't been participating with any regularity for Republicans. One can't help but appreciate that race mattered, and race was a factor there. Donald Trump saw that data, he understood the data, and he knew that he could play to it in ways that, again, would animate a new kind of performance for him. Couple that with the Great Recession that we all experienced around the world, where we had collapse of the markets, collapse of housing in the US as well, at a time when wages were also incredibly suppressed. From 1979 to 2008, when the Great Recession occurred, US corporations had 70% productivity increases, 70%. And yet during that entire period, real wages only went up 12% in the country, right? So if you're somebody who's sitting in one of these rural outposts or even urban centers, you feel as if the system, the game is rigged against you. And if somebody comes out and gives you simplistic analysis and simplistic solutions and says, I'm the one who's going to clean up everything that came before me, whether they're Donald Trump or Jacob Zuma or Bolsonaro, who was elected after a massive corruption scandal, there's an inclination and a tendency to reach for that simplistic solution in difficult and dark times. So when you combine economic decline, racial tension, the polarization that we get in social media that's now become dominant kind of media in our countries, not surprised by the ascent of Donald Trump. And Jacob Zuma is one of the most, he was always underestimated, I thought. People talked about his levels of education, but they didn't understand that that man has a very high emotional intelligence and can read a room better than just about any politician that I've ever been around, and had a dynamism that was authentic, that you can't teach, and that has an appeal. And of course, the similarity is the utter corruption of institutions that were then peopled with mediocre talent who had one thing in common. They were loyal to the leader, loyal to Trump, loyal to Jacob Zuma, and that kind of obsequious loyalty trumped quality in the management of parastatals and other government agencies. Sorry to have gone on.
No, it's fine. But it's interesting because, I mean, talking about who voted for Barack Obama, I mean, I think that, people say that the very same people who voted for Barack Obama twice were the ones who really also came out in support of Donald Trump in 2016.
Yeah, as I suggested to you before, that's not actually the case when you really unpack the numbers, where Donald Trump was able to animate a kind of participation in people who had not voted in 2012 or in 2008, who felt as if something was being lost in their communities. They were losing their culture. Their children wouldn't have the same agency in the country that they did in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, states that had an aging population, that had brain drain, where there are young people who went to university would now move to the coast. And there was this fear that they had about what the future looked like. There's no doubt that there were also individuals who voted for Barack Obama, who voted for Donald Trump. That should not be, I think, the least bit surprising in our national politics in the US or in South Africa, where people are casting about for solutions, in any sense that there's somebody out there who's going to blow everything up and fight on their behalf.
Yeah, I mean, I want to go back to the two things that happened last year that were quite frightening for me and for everyone else. What happened at the Capitol Hill on January 6th, and what happened in South Africa in July riots. I mean, that speaks to the institutions, the challenge to the institutions of democracy. But at the same time, they were able to stand firm. I mean, they were shaken, but they stood firm. And I really want us to talk a little bit about how do we build institutions? How do we make sure that they remain strong? Because without strong institutions, you really can forget about having a successful democratic system. And I'll start with you, Minister Gordhan, around how do we strengthen and rebuild institutions so that can withstand the shocks that we saw?
So you forget my title, you see, but we'll come. How do we build strong? I mean, institutions normally mean two things. One is the values, culture, and the way things are done, would then become norms in a society. And the second is the level of organization, its ethos, and the kind of leadership that it actually has. So clearly, in the first instance, I think South Africa did very well post-1994. New constitution, we had 4 so-called independent homelands, we had 8 so-called self-governing territories. Within a 2 or 3 year period, all of them were combined into a single administration and into 9 provinces. Of course, that had its after effects as well in terms of the mix of culture between what we expected of a bureaucracy and what we had at that particular point in time. But leadership matters, integrity matters, a clear understanding of one's mission, and both at a leadership level and ultimately the ability to motivate people within the institution to adopt that ethos as their ethos and the way they actually do things as well. And equally, institutions play their role on a wider societal platform. So it means that you've got to convince, and I'm thinking about my work at the Revenue Service, you've got to think about the society at large and whether you can persuade them that your mission is a valid one, your mission is one which is in tune with their interests as well. And importantly, what many writers have now talked about, the inclusivity of institutions. So you can have a very elite club, which is an institution, and which just serves the elite. So what does inclusivity mean in a concrete context where people want to feel, as my colleague has been saying, they want to feel included. They want to feel that their views are taken into account. They want to feel that there's a responsiveness to the concerns that they have and the apprehensions that they have, not in a nominal way, through nice speeches and slogans, but at the level of actual delivery, as you pointed out earlier on, in terms which impact upon their lives as well. So institution building is, as we've learned in South Africa, but I'm sure those examples apply elsewhere as well, is one phase. The second phase is to defend those institutions against any attempt at repurposing them. And that means you need a vigilant civil society movement, which is often not quite mass-based in its own right, but play a very important role if they are organized enough to act as a check and balance in many situations. And then thirdly, to be able to renew those institutions as circumstances change so that they remain relevant. There are many institutions around that were built yesterday, but are not relevant today, so to speak. And that applies perhaps to all the post-World War II institutions at a global level. That's a classic example. So global governance today is failing us. The United Nations should be leading the way to solving the problems in Europe. and yet it feels totally incapacitated because its payroll comes from a certain quarter. So I'm being polite again. And that influences the way in which multilateral organizations behave at this point in time. The G20 came up at a time when the financial crisis that was referred to earlier on hit both the United States and the developed world first, and later impacted on us in South Africa as well. I mean, we lost 50, 60 billion rands in revenue, a massive drop in growth, and we never quite recovered from that blow that we experienced then. So all those are, I think, important examples that we need to bear in mind about renewal of institutions and refashioning them, because the G20 today is one that is not capable of coordinating an economic response at a global level. It's not capable of at least getting the 20 members that it has to even respond in terms of some of the climate challenges that we have. That's an agenda that is played out on a different terrain itself. But as you correctly point out, institutions are important, and they need to be nurtured in the right kind of way to play that important role.
Yeah, I mean, I think this leads to this question that's coming on the chat that, you know, where is the space for experimenting with new institutions that serves everyone? Is that the role of democratic activists? And so often these experiments are seen as threats to those in power. So how do we create these spaces for activists to have an impact on institutions? Patrick,
you know,
that's to you.
Palesa, I can't possibly give a better response to your question about resilient institutions than Minister Gordhan just gave. But, you know, to your direct question about innovation, experimentation, and the role of activists, well, you know, I'm not in government anymore, so I can just be direct. So one of my least favorite phrases ever is speaking truth to power. I don't believe that as an activist, when I was as an activist, my goal has never been to enable my community to speak truth to power. Instead, it's been to organize my community into power. I believe that Ahmed Kathrada, Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Barbara, I don't believe that they were just interested in speaking truth to power, but as activists, they understood that they had to find some way to build pluralistic, multiracial, and non-racial majorities to govern to leverage power to govern in the state. Experimentation is important. Experimentation needs to be taken up at the level of municipal governance and federal governance. And if I can, Minister Gordhan, this is one of the things that most exasperated me in my time in South Africa. It both exasperated me and also inspired me. My exasperation as someone who had been a long admirer of the ANC. You know, I came up in my activism in the U.S. first by being introduced to South African activism through culture, because culture was the point of entry for me. The arts, music, etc., writing, literature, and then through ANC activists who had been in exile. When I arrived in the country, I saw these great young ANC cadre who were at the municipal level, who'd never seemed to be given the space for experimentation, the space for innovation. I really thought that in the main metro centers, particularly in the centers of the economy, the ANC needed to cut the cord and to allow 1,000 flowers to bloom for their young thinkers, their young activists to experiment at the mayoral level in Gauteng, for instance. But that always seemed to be thwarted by a, let's just say, a federal instinct in the politics. And so that was disappointing. And it didn't surprise me when I saw the ANC losing majority control in those cities and those mayoralties as a consequences of a lack of innovation and the scaffolding of a bureaucracy that was old, and didn't work to the benefit of young South Africans or the majority of South Africans. In any open society, democracy can only be resilient if institutions are open to interrogation, open to criticism, and make themselves available for reform. I was really inspired when, as ambassador, I saw President Obama help create the Open Government Partnership, and South Africa took up the mantle of chairing the OGP during my time in government. And I saw South Africa really inspiring transparency and governance in other spaces in the Global South and in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I hope that continues to be a thread and a strong cord at the municipal level that will eventually inspire innovation at the federal level as well.
Okay. Thank you so much. I mean, we're coming to the end of this conversation. And for me, I'd like to really thank both of you for a very interesting and robust conversation about the future of democracy. And I'm very glad to be from South Africa in a country where we are free to say whatever we want to say to the government, to the president, to whatever. That is the freedom that we cherish. And I'm also happy to be living in the United States where we are free to do whatever you really want. And I think I want you to end by saying, what do you think the future of democracy in the world is today?
Patrick?
I'm happy to give the minister the last profound word. I'll just say quickly that the future of democracy in the world today is a hopeful one. One cannot do the kind of work that we all do if you're not a radical optimist. And I'm confident that this next generation of leadership will find ways to use the tools of communication that we now have that enable you to speak to someone halfway around the world with a touch of a button in a way that lifts up affirmative solutions to our challenges, that breaks down issues along transnational lines and enables us to lift up solutions that break through the hyper sovereignty that has crept into too many countries. I'm also confident that there's a generation that is interrogating in a powerful way the very notion of the accumulation and concentration of capital in ways that I believe will lead to progressive solutions on climate, on racial justice, the reform of our courts, the opening of the media, and the creation of more broadly shared equality outcomes in our economies. So I'm hopeful.
Hopeful note, Minister Gordhan?
No, I'm an eternal optimist, so I share the optimism. I think we can draw inspiration from Kathy's words earlier on, where he says prisoners never give up hope. And so hope is what must keep progressives alive and active in whatever situation they find themselves in. But the other lesson about democracy is that it's not a smooth path. It'll have troughs, it'll have peaks, it'll have challenges, but it'll also have fantastic achievements from time to time. But democracy will survive if there's a constant struggle to ensure that it does survive. So it needs fighters, it needs leaders, it needs activists, and above all, it needs visionaries and courage. Because without courage, I mean, we can all be Democrats and sit in our studies or lounges and talk about it. But it's those who want to come out into the open in one form or another that will actually ultimately make the difference. Because what must inspire us is the constant search for human dignity and a better life for all the people that occupy Earth, but also in our own respective countries as well. At the same time, I think it's important, as has just been pointed out, to oppose racism, to ensure that the more developed part of the world stops treating the less developed part of the world with condescension, which is happening far too frequently. And to ensure that authoritarianism doesn't take root to the point where we begin to actually despair. and fight corruption wherever we find it, in whatever form it is in, whether it's in the public domain, private domain, or any other domain as well. But obviously there's a lot to do. And if one is optimistic and motivated by the right kind of values, then we just hand the baton to the next generation like you, Palesa. And let me also congratulate and thank our friends in the United States for their solidarity with the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, but the values that it stands up for. And let's extend our reach so that more and more progressives and optimistic people join this movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to hand over to our convener, Dewhurst, to close this this webinar for us. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Palesa. This has been an inspiring session. On behalf of the U.S. Friends of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, I really want to thank our special presenters today for their thought-provoking contributions to this conversation that really needs to continue. I also want to thank all of the leadership team of the U.S. Friends of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, especially our webinar committee, and also the talented staff of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. The U.S. Friends of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation now are working together to advance social justice in the United States and in South Africa, and to carry on the work of Kathy. We often ask ourselves, what would Kathy say? What would Kathy do? We are often finding ourselves with asking those questions. What we really want to do now, and I think we have some slides, Sean, if you can put these up on the screen. What we really want to do as we close here is to make sure we stay connected. We want to stay connected with you. We want you to stay connected with the work of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. Our friends group is led by a small group of individuals, but we have many friends across the US who've known Kathy or are inspired by his work. This slide gives you a sense of the mission of our organization and our efforts, and we hope that it gives you a little sense of what we're about. I'm not going to take time today to go through that, but I would like to move to the next slide, because we do really indeed want to stay connected, whether it's via Twitter, whether it's via Facebook, whether it's via Instagram or YouTube. It's really important that we stay connected. Future webinars will come forward that will explore issues and experiences in South Africa and the United States, shared experiences, and with our own shared commitment to deepen non-racialism and strengthening participatory democracy. In closing, what I would like to do is to invite you to participate and consider participating now in supporting the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation with a donation. There's information here on how you can do so. There was some in the chat earlier. We also now, in closing, to stay right on time, I want to thank you for participating today, and we hope to see you at future webinars and in person at the Ahmed Kathrada events that are coming forward both this weekend and in the year ahead.